Sometimes the scariest experiences happen when we're all alone, whether in the comfort of your own home or isolated in unfamiliar surroundings. When fear strikes, there's no one around to help. These are two disturbing true stories of people who found themselves in terrifying situations while completely alone. Turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare to be unsettled. Story number 1. The Silent Stalker, expanded. It was a frigid winter night in 2016 when Sarah, a 25-year-old nurse, returned home after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. It was well past midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of a sleepy town, far from any bustling city, far from any immediate help. As she parked her car in the lot and stepped out, a biting wind whipped through her coat, making her shiver. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. She glanced around out of habit. Her apartment building loomed ahead, with only a few lights flickering from the windows of other late-night residents. Despite the stillness, Sarah felt a strange unease creeping up her spine, as if the shadows were hiding something or someone. Once inside her apartment, she bolted the door and sighed in relief. The warmth and familiar surroundings calmed her nerves a bit. She kicked off her shoes, turned on the TV for background noise, and brewed a cup of chamomile tea to help her unwind. The apartment was cozy, but tonight, it felt unusually quiet. Too quiet. As Sarah settled onto the couch, her phone buzzed. A message from her best friend, Kayla, checking in on her after her shift. She smiled, grateful for the brief distraction, but when she looked up at her TV screen again, something out of the corner of her eye made her freeze. A shadow seemed to move just outside her window. Her heart raced. Living on the third floor meant there was no logical way someone could be outside that window. Telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks, Sarah brushed it off. Yet the tension lingered, hanging in the air like a thick, unseen cloud. An hour later, as she prepared for bed, Sarah's nerves had calmed. She changed into her pajamas and climbed into bed, flipping through her phone to help ease her into sleep. The wind howled outside, and the apartment creaked with age, but she was used to those sounds. It wasn't until the tapping began that her heart sank. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible, like a branch lightly brushing against the windowpane. But then, it became rhythmic and deliberate, each tap sending a cold shock of fear through her body. Tap, tap, tap. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was coming from her bedroom window, the very one she had seen the shadow near earlier. She was paralyzed with fear, trying to rationalize the noise. Maybe it was the wind, she thought. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap. Gathering all her courage, Sarah slowly approached the window. Her hands trembled as she reached for the curtain. With one quick motion, she yanked it aside and came face to face with the most horrifying sight she could imagine. Pressing against the glass was a pale face. A wide, sickening grin stretched across its lips, eyes unblinking and black as coal, staring directly at her. The figure's breath fogged the glass, but it didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched. Sarah's scream echoed through the apartment as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and called 911, barely able to explain what she had seen. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived, but by the time they searched outside her building, the figure was gone. All that remained were 2 deep footprints beneath her window, pressed into the fresh snow. No other prints led away, leaving the officers baffled. For weeks after, Sarah couldn't sleep. She would see shadows out of the corner of her eye, hear strange noises at night. She moved out of the apartment soon after, but no matter where she goes, she can't escape the feeling that someone, or something, is still watching her from the dark. Story number 2. The Man in the Cabin, expanded. Jake had always considered himself an outdoor enthusiast. Nature was his escape from the stresses of life. The wilderness was where he found peace, solitude, and a sense of freedom. It was this love for the outdoors that brought him to the remote mountains of Colorado one fall weekend. He had heard about a secluded lake deep in the woods, far from any marked trail, and decided it was the perfect spot for a solo camping trip. The hike to the lake was arduous, taking nearly 6 hours through dense forests and steep terrain. By the time he arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The lake, nestled between towering pines, was breathtaking. Its waters were still, reflecting the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains like a mirror. Jake set up his tent on the shore, close to the tree line, and began gathering wood for a fire. As the fire crackled and the night settled in, Jake sat alone, listening to the sounds of the forest. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional splash of fish in the lake. But as the minutes passed, those comforting sounds seemed to vanish, replaced by an unsettling silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Jake tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination. He was alone in the wilderness. After all, what was there to fear? But the feeling persisted, like a growing sense of dread gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Then he heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps, coming from the trees behind him. He turned, scanning the forest with his flashlight, but saw nothing. Just the dark outlines of trees and the occasional flicker of light reflecting off the lake. He told himself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, wandering through the brush. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder, closer. The rustling became more distinct, and it wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was the slow, deliberate pace of footsteps circling his campsite. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood by the fire, gripping his flashlight. He called out into the darkness, but his voice sounded small and hollow in the vastness of the wilderness. There was no response, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, moving steadily around him. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and the forest fell deathly silent once more. Jake waited, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind racing. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the pounding of his heart in his ears. Then, out of nowhere, he heard it, a low, guttural laugh. It was faint, but unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, sending a cold wave of terror through him. He shined his flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam illuminated nothing but empty forest. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, gripping a makeshift weapon, a thick branch, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the footsteps didn't return, and by morning, the forest seemed peaceful again. Determined to leave, Jake packed up his gear quickly and started the hike back to his car. As he neared the trailhead, something caught his eye. A small, dilapidated cabin, partially hidden among the trees. The cabin looked ancient, with its roof caving in and the windows shattered. But what truly disturbed him was the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Jake could see the silhouette of a figure sitting inside, motionless. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him in any way, but Jake felt its eyes on him, watching, waiting. He didn't stick around to find out who or what it was. He ran the rest of the way to his car and didn't stop until he was miles away from the mountain. To this day, Jake refuses to go camping alone. The wilderness, once his sanctuary, has become a place of nightmares, haunted by the memory of the man in the cabin. Isolation in the wilderness, or the comfort of your own home, can quickly turn into a nightmare when the unknown lurks just beyond reach. Whether it's a silent stalker watching from the shadows or an ominous figure waiting in an abandoned cabin, being alone makes the terror all the more palpable. These true stories remind us that sometimes the scariest part of being alone is realizing that maybe you're not.